What does it mean to be the last? Not simply the final name in a long line of names, but the last breath of something ancient beyond reckoning, the final flicker of a flame lit 3,000 years before your birth. From the sun-scorched banks of the Nile, where Egyptian gods once walked as clearly as morning light on water, there comes a story the ancient world has never truly stopped mourning. A story of a woman who spoke 9 languages and understood the divine tongue of pharaohs, who wore the mask of Isis, bargained with Rome, and held an entire civilization together through the sheer force of her will, even as the sands beneath it were already shifting. She did not simply fall, she chose, and in that choosing she carried 3,000 years of gods, of golden thrones, of sacred rites and serpent crowns, quietly into the dark with her. Welcome to the story of Cleopatra and the last dynasty. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. Before the first stone was laid, before the first name was spoken into the dark, there was the river, wide and slow and silver in the earliest light. It moved through the land the way time itself moves, without hurry, without pause, carrying everything it touched toward the sea. The Nile, older than any word for it, older than the kingdoms that would rise along its banks, the gods that would be carved into its cliffs, the queens who would sail its waters wrapped in gold. Along its shores the reeds stood still in the morning silence. The rich black soil breathed, soft and dark, the way earth breathes when nothing has yet disturbed it. Let yourself be carried now. Let the river take you. We are moving backward through the long sleep of history, gently, slowly, toward a world that once was whole. In the beginning, there was the sun, not merely light, not warmth alone, but a God, choosing. Each morning, Ra stepped into his golden bark and sailed the great arc of heaven, and with that act, the world was made again. The Egyptians did not speak of creation as something finished and done. It was happening now, every dawn, as the horizon split open with rose and burning gold, and the first ray fell upon the river. Ra was that ray. He was the warmth on a child's face, the heat rising from the black soil, the shimmer at the edge of sight. Millions of people, farmers, priests, pharaohs, opened their eyes each morning and understood that a God had chosen to return. That faith was not small. It was the very ground beneath everything that would follow. Yet not all gods lived in the light. Beneath the living world, in the deep and hushed halls where the dead gathered like whispered names, another presence waited, Osiris. He stood still as stone, wrapped in the white linen of the tomb, his skin the soft green of new shoots pushing through dark soil. His face was calm, not cold, never cold, but patient in the way that mountains are patient. He held his crook and flail crossed over his chest, those ancient symbols of tending and of harvesting. He had known death. He had passed through it, been torn apart and made whole again, and so he understood something no living god could, that endings are never final. The Egyptians loved him for this above all else. In Osiris, every soul found its deepest hope, that to die was only to return. But Osiris did not walk alone in the story the Egyptians told. Beside him always stood Isis, and she was something older than power, older than kingship. She was love made patient. She was the one who had gathered her husband's scattered body from the far ends of the world and breathed him back to life with nothing but her grief and her will. Now she stood in the deep sanctuary, lamp-lit, the stone walls dense with the words of 10,000 years. Her wings spread wide, each feather black and white as truth, filling the narrow chamber until there was no space left that was not hers. She was the mother of all things. She was the goddess who remembered, and she would wait, still and watchful across the long centuries, until a queen came who was bold enough to wear her face. Far to the south, in the city of Memphis, there stood a throne room of stone. No king sat there in that moment, yet the room was full of something older than any name. The double crown waited in the shadowed air, a white spire cradled within a red curve, symbol of two lands made one. The crook and the flail lay crossed, as they had always been crossed, speaking of a power that was not merely given but inherited from the gods themselves. Here, a pharaoh was never only a man. He was the living hinge between the breathing world and the world beyond breath, the point where sky met earth and held. 3,000 years of belief had worn grooves into that stone floor, deep as rivers. Nowhere was that inheritance more visible than at Giza. Stand on the plateau at midday, and the pyramids did not merely rise, they blazed. When they were new, each face was cased in polished white limestone, fitted so smooth and set so true that the desert sun struck them like mirrors and flung their light across the sand for miles in every direction. They were not monuments to the dead. They were declarations, proof written in stone that a people had looked at the horizon and decided to exceed it. By the time Cleopatra was born, those pyramids had already stood for 2,000 years. They were ancient when she first saw them, ancient when her great-grandparents were children. The world that built them had risen, held, and changed beyond recognition. And still the stones remained, unchanged, unhurried, watching the desert as they always had. One name above all others marked the high point of that long story: Ramesses. He ruled for 67 years, outliving his own children, carving his image into cliff faces and temple walls from the Nile Delta down to the deep south of Nubia. At Abu Simbel, 4 colossal likenesses of him sat carved from living rock, each one taller than 10 men standing, gazing out across the desert with the serene certainty of someone who had never once doubted his place in the order of things. He was Pharaoh, He was God, he was Egypt made flesh. The sand shifted around his feet. The sun hammered down without mercy. Still he sat, unmoved, unhurried, the very image of a civilization at its fullest, proudest height before the long, slow turning of the world began. That turning came slowly, as all great turnings do. Seasons folded into centuries. The Nile rose and fell, rose and fell. And the black silt it left behind fed wheat and barley, and the quiet lives of 10,000 farmers who never knew the names of the men who claimed dominion over them. Persians came, hard riders from the east who looked upon the temples with calculating eyes. They took the throne, renamed the land in their own tongue, then faded. Egyptian hands lit the old lamps again. Greeks moved along the coasts, drawn by the warmth. The desert held everything the way deep water holds a stone, surrounding it completely, changing it not at all. Empires passed like weather. The obelisks remained, the river remained. The long, patient country simply waited, as it had always waited, for whoever would come next. He came from the north, through the delta, and the Egyptians did not flee. They opened their doors. They lined the roads. After generations of Persian rule, cold, distant, contemptuous of the old gods, the young Macedonian seemed, by comparison, like something the river itself had sent. Alexander entered Memphis at dawn, when the temple of Ptah was still wrapped in incense smoke, and the priests stood like pale shapes in the dimness, watching. He did not stride in as a soldier. He knelt. He made the offerings. He spoke the names of the gods in the forms the priests required. Whether he believed, no one could say. But he understood that a country as old as this one demanded a certain reverence, and he gave it fully, without hesitation. The Greek world had touched the Egyptian one. Neither would ever be entirely itself again. What Alexander left behind was a city, not a settlement, not a garrison, a city dreamed whole from the edge of the Mediterranean, laid out in clean lines where once there had been only salt wind and fishing villages. Alexandria. The name itself carried a kind of weight. From the sea you saw it before you understood it. The Pharos rose first, a great white tower, stage upon stage, climbing the pale morning sky until its summit flame was visible 30 miles out across open water. Ships found their way home by it. Men wrote poems about it. It was, for centuries, simply the tallest thing most people had ever seen. Behind it spread the city. Wide marble avenues crossed at right angles, harbors deep enough for the largest vessels in the world, markets where a merchant might hear 7 languages before noon. Somewhere inside its walls, the library held the memory of the known world. Scroll upon scroll, room upon room, quietly keeping everything. The man who built it all was a soldier. Ptolemy had ridden beside Alexander, had slept in the same dust, eaten the same hard bread, watched the same impossible victories unfold across Persia and India, and the long burning road between. When Alexander died young, feverish, far from home, the empire he had torn from the world was simply left there, like a fire no one knew how to put out. And so the generals divided it. Ptolemy took Egypt. He walked into Memphis, into the temple smoke and the river light, and the 10,000 years of accumulated holiness, and he decided, quietly, with the calm audacity of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being afraid of it, that he would not merely rule this place, he would become it, a Macedonian soldier, a living pharaoh. Not far from the palace, he built something else entirely, something that would outlast every army, every treaty, every name carved into stone. The Library of Alexandria rose at the edge of the harbor, its halls long and cool and hushed, smelling of cedar oil and papyrus, and the slow, sweet decay of ancient reed. Scrolls lined the walls from floor to ceiling, hundreds of thousands of them, bundled and labeled and resting in their cedar slots like sleeping things. Here were the mathematicians of Babylon, the physicians of Persia, the poets of Athens, and the astronomers of Mesopotamia, their observations pressed into fragile sheets and carried across deserts and seas to rest, at last, in this one luminous room. Scholars moved between the shelves in the slanted afternoon light, their linen robes catching the gold that fell through the high, narrow windows. It was the closest the ancient world ever came to dreaming with its eyes open. Not far from there, in the temples that lined the Nile southward, a different kind of dreaming took shape. Step inside the temple at Dendera on a quiet night, and the walls will tell you everything. Greek columns rise in the outer halls, clean and ordered, echoing the courts of Athens and Alexandria. Yet press deeper, and the stone becomes Egyptian, dense with carved gods, with hieroglyphs stacked floor to ceiling, with the old language of a world that had not forgotten itself. This was the great double life of the Ptolemies. At court, they spoke Greek, ate from silver bowls, and debated philosophy as their Macedonian blood demanded. But in the lamplight of the sanctuaries, they wore the double crown. They carried the crook. They became Pharaoh. Egypt did not simply accept its new rulers. It translated them slowly, carefully, into something it could recognize. The feasts of the Ptolemaic court were things of legend even while they lived. The great hall of the palace blazed with 100 oil lamps, their light catching the rims of golden cups and the jeweled throats of those who drank from them. Silk from lands so distant they barely had names draped the long tables. Perfume hung in the warm air, thick and sweet, laced, it was said, with fine gold dust that shimmered on the skin of every guest. Some banquets lasted days, spilling from night back into night, the music never quite stopping. Yet beneath all that gorgeous excess, power was always moving. A cup refilled at the wrong moment, a whispered word at the edge of the lamplight. The Ptolemaic court did not fracture loudly. It fractured slowly, sweetly, like honey softening something from the inside. And so the corridors beyond those bright halls told a different story. Walk them at night, past the guttering lamp, past the doorway with no name above it, and you would feel it. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, yet it could not stop devouring itself. Mothers poisoned sons, brothers drowned sisters. Children were made orphans by their own parents' ambition. Each generation looked at its nearest blood and saw not family, but a rival breathing too close to the throne. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was fear, ancient, animal fear, dressed in gold and linen. A dynasty so desperate to survive that it fed upon the very ones who carried its name forward. The lamp guttered. The corridor held its silence. Such fear did not die with one generation. It lived on, quieter, more humiliating, in the man who would become Cleopatra's father. His name was Ptolemy XII, and history has not been kind to him. His own people called him Auletes, the flute player, not as a term of affection, but as a kind of soft contempt. A king who played music while his kingdom bled. He had traveled to Rome. He stood in that great marble hall, beneath its cold northern light, surrounded by senators who regarded him the way a man regards a merchant who has already agreed to a price and simply doesn't know it yet. Ptolemy offered gold, enormous, almost unimaginable sums to secure their recognition of his throne. Rome accepted the gold, then demanded more. He paid. He always paid. A dynasty that had once commanded the ancient world now stood, hat in hand, before men who would one day take everything. But there was a child in Alexandria who was learning something different. She moved through the library the way water moves through stone, slowly and with great effect. Row upon row of papyrus scrolls rose around her, their edges pale gold in the afternoon light that fell in long shafts from the high, narrow windows. She would reach up, unroll one, and read. Then another still. She was learning languages, not just Greek, the tongue of her dynasty, but the old Egyptian priest's speech, Aramaic, the lilting sounds of Ethiopian traders, the Latin that Rome was beginning to press against every border in the world. She absorbed them the way the Nile absorbs rain, quietly, completely, without waste. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, the movements of stars. She read all of it, and she remembered. This hunger, patient, bottomless, utterly serious, was not separate from the woman she would become. It was her foundation. And language was perhaps the most intimate expression of that hunger. She spoke Egyptian, not the stiff ceremonial phrases a ruler might memorize for temple rituals, but the living tongue of the people working the fields and the markets and the riverbanks. No Ptolemaic ruler before her had bothered. For 2.5 centuries, her ancestors had ruled Egypt without ever truly speaking to it. She also held Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, the languages of Ethiopia and the eastern desert peoples, each one a different door into a different world. When an ambassador arrived from a distant court, she would receive him in his own words, not through an interpreter standing between them. In his own words, from her own lips. There is something quietly extraordinary in that. Language is not merely communication. It is recognition. It says, "I came far enough toward you to find you where you live." She offered that to nearly everyone she met. She was still young when her father placed her beside him on the throne, a girl learning the weight of a crown by wearing it. When he died, the throne passed between them like something fragile. Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, co-rulers by law, rivals by nature. He was a child, but the men around him were not, and they saw in his youth a door they could walk through. Within a year, they had moved against her. Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria, out of Egypt, into the desert at the edge of everything she had ever known. She made her camp there in the shifting heat where the sand met the last pale light of the sun going down. She had no palace. She had no court. She had only herself, which, as it happened, had always been enough. Not far from there, in the great throne room of Alexandria, a boy sat where a pharaoh ought to have been. Ptolemy XIII was perhaps 10 years old, small and slight, his dark curly hair made smaller still by the oversized diadem that slid loose against his brow. The throne dwarfed him. The chamber dwarfed him. Even the silence seemed too large for him to fill. He had advisors, of course, men who whispered in both his ears and steered him like a rudder steers a ship. They gave him the crown. They gave him the words to say. What they wanted was a boy who would not think for himself. In this, at least, they had chosen well. He was not cruel by nature. He was simply young and frightened and entirely in someone else's hands. Not far from there, across the blue width of the Mediterranean, a ship was coming. Julius Caesar sailed into Alexandria's harbor as the sun fell low and the Pharos lighthouse blazed its signal fire against the darkening sky, a flame that could be seen for 30 miles, they said, and tonight it lit the Roman general's face like a torch held close. He stood at the prow, lean, still, unhurried, a man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had broken Pompeii, who had remade the world in his own image and found the task unremarkable. He looked at Alexandria, and he did not reach for a word like beautiful, though it was. He reached, as he always did, for the word useful. The city breathed toward him across the water, warm, layered, smelling of cardamom and salt, and something older beneath, something that had been burning since before Rome was a village. That same night, on the other side of the palace walls, a woman was being carried through a corridor. She lay still inside a rolled length of linen, her knees drawn close, her breathing slow and controlled. Outside, her brother's guards stood at every gate. Inside, she was nothing more than a merchant's delivery, a bundle, a gift, something ordinary enough to pass without question. This was not comedy. This was not a trick born of desperation. It was a calculation made by a mind that had been reading power the way a sailor reads water, watching for the current beneath the surface. Cleopatra was 21 years old. She had already been exiled by her own brother, stripped of her throne and pushed to the very edge of everything her family had built. She knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, exactly what she needed to do. The guard passed, the corridor held its breath. She did not. She stepped into the lamplight. Caesar looked up from his maps. He was not a man given to surprise. 50 years of war and politics had trained that out of him. Yet something shifted behind his eyes. Before him stood not the disheveled exile he might have imagined, but a woman entirely composed, entirely present, as if she had simply chosen this room and this moment from among all possible rooms and moments. She spoke first, in Latin. He answered in Greek. For a long moment, neither moved. The lamps threw their warm, unsteady light across the table between them, across the maps, the coastlines, the territories each of them wanted. Caesar had conquered half the known world. Cleopatra had lost a kingdom the size of a continent. Both understood, in the particular way that brilliant people understand things before they are spoken aloud, that the other was not merely useful, the other was dangerous. The other was interesting. In Caesar's world, those two things were rarely so perfectly the same. She understood something that Caesar, for all his brilliance, could only observe from the outside. Egypt was not a country held together by armies or laws. It was held together by the divine. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler. The pharaoh was the living bridge between the human world and the world of the gods. And if that bridge was not tended, everything would slowly fall. So Cleopatra tended it. At the temple of Dendera, deep in the night, she moved through the inner sanctuary wrapped in the white linen and wide feathered wings of Isis herself. The torches burned low and warm along the painted walls, their light sliding across centuries of carved stone. She wore the gold collar, the throne crown. She carried herself not as a queen performing a ceremony, but as something older, something the stone walls themselves seemed to recognize. This was theology as politics, but it was also, perhaps, something more than that. She had spoken the old language since childhood, had read the sacred texts in their original form. When the priests looked at her, They did not see translation. They saw arrival. Not long after, she brought him to the river. The royal barge moved south through the afternoon, wide and unhurried, its gilded hull catching the light that fell across the water in long golden sheets. Caesar stood at the rail and looked out at a world that seemed to have no beginning. Green fields ran to the edge of sight. Beyond them, pale cliffs rose from the desert like sleeping forms. Villages drifted past, then temples, then the slow, dark mouths of older temples still, stone faces half swallowed by sand, watching the river as they had watched it for 1,000 years before Rome existed. She let the silence do its work. She knew these shores. She named what he saw, the gods carved into each pylon, the stories sealed in every wall. She was not merely showing him a kingdom. She was offering him the oldest world on earth and asking, gently, what he intended to do with it. He came into the world at dawn, when the Nile light was pale and the air still cool. She held him small, impossibly small, wrapped tight in white linen, his face the unreadable face of every newborn, ancient and new at once. She named him Ptolemy Caesar. The people called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. In his blood ran the oldest dynasty on earth and the most powerful republic the world had ever seen. No infant had ever carried so much. He did not know this, of course. He simply breathed and slept and breathed again as the light grew slowly golden through the stone window above them both. Not far from there, across the wide sea to the north, another story was already moving toward hers. In the port city of Tarsus, where the summer heat pressed down like a hand on every stone and shadow, a Roman general held court among his officers and maps and the dry smell of a military camp baking under the midday sun. His name was Mark Antony. He was a large man in the way that certain men are large, not merely in body, though he had that too. The broad chest and soldier's bearing earned across 100 campaigns. But in presence, he filled a room. He filled a silence. Caesar had trusted him completely, and when Caesar fell, it was Antony who stood over the body and wept without shame before all of Rome. He was generous, impulsive. He made decisions the way rivers move, with enormous force and very little hesitation. So when Cleopatra decided to meet him, she did not simply arrive, she appeared. The river Cydnus ran through the city of Tarsus, and on the afternoon she chose, it carried something it had never carried before. A barge moved upstream against the current, gilded from prow to stern, its polished hull catching the light and throwing it back onto the water in long, shivering ribbons. Purple silk sails hung from the mast, wide and slow, perfumed with frankincense, so that the scent reached the banks long before the ship did. Silver oars pulled in time to the sound of flutes and harps. At the center of the deck, beneath a canopy of gold cloth, sat Cleopatra, dressed as Aphrodite herself, draped in sheer fabric, fanned by small boys costumed as winged cupids, attended by women robed as sea nymphs at every rope and rudder. The crowds lining the banks fell utterly silent. Then they surged forward to see. Far from that gilded river, in a city of marble and noise, another man was watching the world arrange itself to his liking. Octavian stood on the steps of the Senate in the full weight of a Roman noon. The light fell without mercy on the white stone, flattening everything, leaving no shadow to hide in. He was not imposing to look at. Lean, pale still, the kind of man whose eyes moved more than his hands. Those who met him often came away unsettled without knowing why. He was not a general in the way Antony was. He did not hunger for the roar of a crowd. What he possessed was something quieter and far more durable: patience. He had planned so many steps ahead that anger was simply unnecessary. Every rival, every shift of power, every whisper from the east, he had already considered it. He turned from the Senate doors, and somewhere distantly he was already thinking of Egypt. And in Alexandria the sun blazed without mercy over the great gymnasium, where 10,000 people had gathered to witness something the world had never quite seen before. Mark Antony sat upon a throne of silver. Beside him, upon a throne of gold, sat Cleopatra, robed as Isis, still and luminous beneath the open sky. Before them, arranged on smaller thrones, were their children. One by one, Antony rose and named them heirs to kingdoms. Cleopatra, Queen of Kings. Caesarion, son of Julius Caesar, he declared, the rightful heir to his father's name. The crowd roared. The afternoon light fell hard and golden. Across the marbles in Rome, Octavian received the news in silence. Then he read it aloud to the Senate, slowly, carefully, letting each word land like a stone dropped into still water. The words spread through Rome the way smoke spreads through a closed room, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Octavian was patient. He did not shout. He did not need to. Instead, he let the city do his work for him, feeding it small things, a rumor here, a whispered accusation there, until the streets themselves seemed to murmur her name with suspicion. She was called a sorceress, an Eastern temptress who had turned Rome's greatest general soft and foolish. The forums buzzed with it. Words appeared on walls in rough daubed letters, warnings, insults, the particular cruelty of a crowd that has found someone to fear. Cleopatra, far away in Alexandria, was being unmade. not with swords, not yet, with words and with the slow, ancient power of a story told loudly enough and long enough to become true. In Alexandria, in a small lamplit room off the palace corridor, Antony sat alone. The reed pen had dried twice while he stared at the half-unrolled sheet before him. He dipped it again. He wrote, not many words. A divorce required none of the ceremony a marriage demands. Octavia had been patient and faithful and good. He knew all of this. The pen moved anyway. When it was done, he set the pen beside the lamp and watched the ink dry in the warm, still air. He did not blow on it to hasten the drying. He simply sat. Somewhere across the sea, Octavian would receive this letter, and something in him would turn like a key in a lock. He had given the man exactly what he needed. The lamp flame leaned without wind. She came to the treasury alone. No attendants, no scribes. Only the lamp she carried herself, its small flame catching the stacked gold and sending long shadows up the stone walls. She walked slowly between the shelves of grain tallies and tribute records, past the sealed oil jars and the cedar chests banded in bronze. She had counted this wealth since girlhood. She knew its weight, the way a shepherd knows his flock. Now she looked at all of it and made her decision, without flinching. The ships would be provisioned, the grain would go, the gold would move to the fleet. Others might have hesitated, might have held something back, some reserve against failure. She held nothing back. This was not recklessness, it was clarity. She had seen the shape of what was coming, measured it honestly, and chosen to meet it with everything she had. The first light of the 31st year before the Common Era found two worlds meeting on the water off Actium's Cape. Octavian's fleet rowing out from the north, Antony's ships heavy with men and iron, the sea between them already gray with early smoke. For a time the two forces held each other in a terrible stillness, the way storm fronts pause before collapsing into one another. Then the oars churned, the rams struck, and the morning came apart. What followed was less a battle than a slow, crushing confusion. Ships locking together, fire spreading from deck to deck, the sea itself going dark with debris and ruin. Antony's lines bent, his larger vessels, built for power, could not match Octavian's smaller galleys for speed or turning. And so it was that Cleopatra's squadron, 60 ships holding in formation behind the main engagement, read what the morning was writing on the water. She ordered the purple sails raised. The ships came about and ran south, through the one gap still open in the carnage, toward Egypt. Antony saw the purple sails go up. He stood at the rail of his flagship, the battle still roaring around him, and he watched her go. Something in him went with her, something so essential that what remained was only a shape of a man, standing in armor he no longer needed. He gave no order to his captains. He spoke no farewell. He simply had a small, fast vessel brought alongside, stepped down into it, and told the oarsmen to follow south. Those who loved him later said it was weakness. Perhaps it was, but there is another way to read it, that Antony had long since made his choice, had made it so completely that the battle behind him was already someone else's war, fought over a world he had already left. Without her, there was no empire worth winning. Without Egypt, there was no Antony left to win it. She arrived home before the news did. The fleet entered Alexandria harbor at dusk, its banners lifted high, bright cloth snapping in the sea wind, colors that spoke of triumph. The people watching from the shore would not have known, not yet, that those banners were a kind of mercy. Cleopatra understood something that generals rarely do, that a city's courage is fragile, and panic, once it takes hold, moves faster than any army. So she gave them a story instead of the truth. She had always known how to do this, how to shape the air around her, how to hold a room, a harbor, a civilization inside the frame of her choosing. Even now, sailing home through the warm amber last of the day's light, she was still a queen performing queenship, still managing what could be managed, still refusing to let go of the story before she absolutely had to. But the story was already being written elsewhere, far to the east, where the desert road unrolled itself toward Alexandria like a pale ribbon across the sand. Octavian's legions moved through the last gray hour before sunrise. They moved without trumpet, without ceremony, just the low rhythmic press of 10,000 sandals on stone and dust, the creak of leather, the soft clank of metal warming slowly in the dawn air. Dust rose in columns behind them, catching the first gold at the horizon's edge and glowing like something lit from within. The city appeared ahead, low walls, the lighthouse still burning on its promontory, the sea a dark line beyond, and Alexandria, for all its grandeur, seemed to hold itself very still. The markets had not opened. The harbor boats sat without oars. Even the gulls, usually so loud along the waterfront, seemed to have settled somewhere out of sight. The world was waiting. Then Antony rode out. He took what men remained loyal, a column of cavalry, lean and road-worn, their horses raising pale dust in the morning light. The plain east of Alexandria was flat and open, the kind of ground where everything is visible and nothing is hidden, and he rode into it with the same straight back he had carried across a dozen campaigns in a dozen different lands. For a little while it worked. The Roman advance faltered. There was a collision of horses and shields, a brief and brilliant disorder, and Antony moved through it the way he always had, instinctively, furiously, as though war itself remembered him. But it was a last coin, spent in a single morning. The old fire burned clean and bright, and then it began to dim. He had pushed them back. He had won that small, silent hour. It would be the last thing he won. Then the rumor came. Someone, it is not known who, whether friend or enemy or simply a frightened messenger who believed what he had been told, brought word to Antony that Cleopatra was dead, that she had taken her own life inside the mausoleum, that she was gone. He believed it. Perhaps it was the exhaustion. Perhaps it was that part of him had already begun to let go. Whatever the reason, the news moved through him the way cold water moves through an open hand. It was simply gone, the last thing worth holding. He drew his sword. He fell upon it. The blade caught him deep enough to bring him down, but not deep enough to end it quickly. And so he lay there in the long afternoon light, bleeding, asking those around him to finish what he had started. No one would. They carried him instead, this broken, still breathing man, to the sealed stone walls of the mausoleum where Cleopatra, very much alive, had barricaded herself inside. She heard his voice through the stone, and something in her broke open. The window was narrow and high, and Cleopatra pulled him up with her own hands. Her women beside her, all of them straining, the ropes biting into their palms. Antony was heavy with his wound. He made no sound of complaint. When at last they drew him over the sill and lowered him to the stone floor, she knelt beside him without hesitation, pressing her hands to his side, her white linen dark with what she could not stop. He looked at her the way a man looks at the last good thing he will ever see. She wept, not quietly. She called out his name and her own grief back and forth, filling the sealed chamber with sound. He asked her, gently, to be calm. He asked her to remember that he had lived well and had loved well, and that this was not the worst ending a man could find. She held him until he was still. They came for her the following day. She had dressed with great care. The white linen was fresh, the gold collar clean at her throat, the kohl drawn carefully around her eyes. If she was to be seen, she would be seen as herself, as a queen, as a goddess, as the last of her line. Octavian received her in a room that had once belonged to her father. He had not redecorated it, but somehow it already felt like his. He sat with the careful stillness of a man who has decided everything in advance and is merely waiting for the world to confirm it. She spoke. She was brilliant, as she had always been, warm and measured, sorrowful in precisely the right degree. She had done this before, and it had worked before. But Octavian only listened, pale eyes steady, a faint and practiced smile on his lips. He was polite. He was utterly unmoved. He was already, she understood, calculating the width of the streets in Rome. She knew then. She had always known how to read a room, and this room had told her everything. The last morning came quietly, as last mornings often do. Light moved through the high window of her chamber, pale at first, then warming to gold, spreading across the marble floor like something gentle and unhurried. She bathed in cool water scented with cedar and lotus. She let her women dress her, the white linen pleated just so, the gold collar settled at her throat, the kohl drawn carefully along each eye. Not for him, not for anyone watching, for herself and for the long line of those who had come before her. She ate figs, slowly, tasting each one. Then she sat at the small writing table, took up the reed pen, and wrote to Octavian a single request, that she be buried beside Antony wherever he lay. She sealed the letter, set it aside, and sat for a long moment in the morning light. Then she called for the basket. It came wrapped in linen as she had arranged, carried by a servant who asked nothing and was told nothing. Cleopatra sat very still as the room settled around her. The midday sun lay across the stone floor in a wide, warm band. Beyond the window, just visible, the Nile moved as it had always moved, slow, brown, indifferent to the ambitions of queens. She did not hurry. When the Romans came and found her, she was dressed in her full robes, reclining as though resting. Her crown was in place. She had chosen how she would be seen at the end, and she had chosen well. Octavian wept, they said, or performed weeping. With him, the two were the same. What followed was the slow work of forgetting. Rome renamed her city, melted her likenesses, set their own gods in the temples where Isis had stood for 1,000 years. The papyrus scrolls were scattered. The old language faded from living mouths until only stone remembered it. But the river did not care about any of that. It rose each summer, as it had risen before the first pharaoh set a crown upon his head. It flooded the fields and fed the grain and held the living in its patient arms. The names changed, the faces changed, the prayers changed in tongue if not in longing. Still the river ran, and somewhere beneath all that accumulated silence, beneath the Roman marble and the desert sand and the long weight of centuries, the old world did not disappear. It only changed its form the way water changes form, into cloud, into rain, into the dark soil of the delta, and then quietly back into the river again. Rest now. The story has found its end. The river still flows. Let it carry you.